So I am here to talk about healthier, safer, and more successful communities. And the reason we talk about communities is that Street Games as an organisation, we are unashamedly and unapologetically on the side of children and young people that have no money. Because as you'll see as we go through the presentation, the challenges in their lives in terms of being involved in sport and physical activity are far more significant than some of us might imagine. But at the same time, and it's great to hear somebody start by talking about asset-based community development, these communities, the young people that live in them, are absolutely fantastic assets, and their capability and the things that they can do for themselves with support, not being done to, can also be fantastic. Thank you. For my moving on piece here. That one there. So Street Games. Our vision, as I said, is of healthier, safer, more successful communities through sport. And our mission, we've altered slightly over the last 6 months because we've been talking to some of the young people who were involved in activities that we ran about 15 years ago. So some of the young people who lived in West Bromwich, some of the ones who lived up in Merseyside, about how being involved in their local neighbourhood project and getting involved in sport and physical activity has affected them. And when you talk to them, what you realise when they compare themselves to some of their friends, being involved in sport and physical activity in their neighbourhoods has transformed their lives. It's changed the direction that they've taken. It's given them a new career, a new set of friends, a new set of skills, and some real powerful aspiration for the future. So I sometimes think we understate just how valuable sport can be. And until you hear it directly from those who've lived through it, I think we sometimes don't take account of just how transformative the power of sport and physical activity is. And as an organisation, we've always talked about doorstep sport. Now, for some of you, you'll think of doorstep sport as the programme that we ran that was generously funded by Sport England between 2013 and 2017. But actually, doorstep sport isn't a programme. It's a method, it's an approach, it's a way of delivering sport that suits the needs of young people from low-income, underserved communities. And the reason it works for them is it's been delivered at the right time. So it's not delivered at 9 o'clock in the morning if you're dealing with teenagers at weekends, because I have two and they don't get up that early. It's delivered in the right place. And somebody said, I think it was Rachel said earlier, that lives are lived locally. In these communities, you have something that we call a subjective neighbourhood. And that may mean that young people don't go any more than a mile from their house. They might go to school, they might go to the shop, they might go to the park, but often they don't travel any further than their subjective neighbourhood. So having sport within that neighbourhood is crucial. The right style is about making it fit for the young people. So making sure that young people feel comfortable, whether that's about the expectations on dress code, whether that's about not doing skills and drills if they don't want formal sport, the right price, and there's much debate in the academic literature about this. The truth of the matter is the work we've done with Sheffield Hallam suggests that families in the lowest income bracket have £3.21 per week to spend on sport and active leisure. So the right price, if you've got 4 kids, is free, because you haven't got the wherewithal to spend a lot of money on sport and physical activity. And perhaps most fundamentally, by the right people, the trusted local adults that young people and children in these neighbourhoods really respond to. And we know, over 15 years of developing the approach to doorstep sport, that if sport is delivered appropriately within these neighbourhoods, then it can do all these things. It can reduce antisocial behaviour if it's delivered in the right way. It certainly, wherever there's activity, addresses inactivity. But we also know that with the right type of offer, you can close the activity gender gap and get young girls and women involved in sport through providing the right type of sport for their needs. Now, I don't know whether this one has actually been set up as a poll on the system. I've got some of the polls in my slides here, but in terms of how many children in the UK we think might be living in poverty by 2022, the actual answer to this one, because I don't think it is on the poll, is 5 million. It's a staggering number of children, and that will actually have increased from the figure above it in the last 18 months. So it was 4.2 million when the Children's Society were looking at their figures last year. It will be 5 million by 2022. And we know that the pandemic has affected low-income areas in a much harsher way. The unemployment level in the country is supposed to rise to 7.5%. Nearly a third of lower paid employees have either lost their jobs or furloughed as a result of the crisis, whereas only 1 in 10 of the top earners have been similarly affected. We know as well that, incredibly sadly, the death rates in the most deprived areas from COVID are double what they are in the least deprived. Now, it feels a bit like a wall of numbers the last 12 months. Every time you turn the news on, there's more data and more numbers. I was talking to one of our projects in the West Midlands a couple of weeks ago, and they were telling me about a young person who had had 3 family members die in a 6-week period. That's when it came home to me just how different the experience of COVID has been in some of the communities that Street Games is concerned about. But there is hope, and the hope lies in these amazing locally trusted organisations who sit in the heart of underserved low-income neighbourhoods, and they have the trust, as Warren was talking about, of their neighbourhood, and as a result they have the permission of local people to provide activities, to provide services, to provide support in a non-stigmatising way. And as an organisation, we're very lucky as Street Games that many of these organisations trust us, and they tell us through our surveys and through discussions with us that they believe we want the same thing for their children and young people that they do. And one of the greatest assets of these organisations is that they've always been agile. They've always been able to adapt to the needs of their community. They've always been able to find ways to get funding in through a mix of partnerships and funding bids and raising money through car washes. And during the pandemic, these locally trusted organisations have stepped up even further. They have been there, the ones that have been giving out food parcels, the ones that have been collecting prescriptions for older residents, the ones that have been helping those who've lost their jobs fill out their universal credit forms. They have just been a vital part of the pandemic relief. And actually, when we talk to a lot of them now, they're exhausted because of 13 months of trying to help some of the communities that need the most in the country. They are exhausted, and perhaps more worryingly, they're financially exhausted because they haven't been able to raise money in the way that they might have done before the pandemic, and there is a real risk of financial fragility. And we conducted a financial survey with a lot of these organisations, and as you can see, a third of them are really concerned about their ability to continue beyond 6 months, with a very small percentage worried about 3 months. But obviously, we've immediately, working with partners, tried to intervene to support those organisations. And one of the great things about the pandemic relief and response from funders, and I very much include Sport England and Sport Wales in this, is that the funding has been targeted to really help those organisations that need it most. And again, the poll that I've put in here, we interviewed locally trusted organisations the year before the pandemic, and nearly 60% of them said they were comfortable or confident about their financial position. When we carried out a similar survey in July last year, that figure had dropped unbelievably to 18% felt they had any kind of financial confidence for the future. And for a lot of them, they have no reserves. Nearly a third of organisations we spoke to do not have any savings in the bank to deal with the issues from the pandemic. For a lot of them, they usually go in and deliver activity in schools, which helps them to fund the free activity they then offer to their communities. But as we all know, those income generation opportunities have gone in the past year. And as we also know, based on the data I just shared, the need in these communities is greater. And because of the types of relief that these organisations have been offering to their community members, their costs have gone up. And so they're not just sitting there and waiting to see what happens. But what's really worrying is that nearly 70% of them have had to reduce the offer that they make to their local communities. And nearly 44% of them have cut operational costs. And when you start talking about cutting operational costs, what you're really talking about is jobs. People who work with people, who support young people to develop in sport, in physical activity, and in life. And they tell us that the grant landscape is even more competitive than it was previously. They don't have enough people who are trained up to complete funding bids. Time is just critical because these are front-facing organisations who work right in the heart of neighbourhoods and spend their time supporting members of their community. They don't want to spend lots of time on administration and filling in forms. But they are adapting because, as I said before, they are incredibly agile. So what we know about their immediate support needs and the things that those organisations like ourselves can do to help support what they do in their neighbourhoods, undoubtedly direct investment, and more than that, the help to fundraise if they don't have the skills or the capacity. We've found over the last 12, 13 months that just giving space to listen and offer really practical and personalised support to the exact needs of an organisation in its own neighbourhood has just been crucial. We've also found that sharing ideas and approaches for staying in touch with young people through lockdown, for mentoring and supporting online, has been really important for them to keep their connections with their neighbourhoods. And the training that we've done with staff and volunteers has very much been around things like mental health conversations, 5 ways to well-being, and supporting young people through a very difficult period. And then at a national and a local level, advocating for what these organisations that prior to the pandemic, in many people's eyes, were invisible, can do to support their communities. So the third poll that I had in here, because I'm going to now talk a little about the voice of young people, was what young people told us was most important to them about their doorstep sport sessions that they missed in lockdown. And I'll share the answer with you in just a moment. The lockdown had a huge impact on young people's lives, and in particular their education and their social life. And 17% of the young people we talked to had either stopped working or received a pay cut. And unsurprisingly, with all the coverage around mental health, but again, very worryingly, 15% immediately told us when we asked them back in May last year that the biggest impact of COVID was on how they were feeling lethargic, feeling isolated, feeling lonely, and saying that their mental health had been affected. Although you'll have seen the national data around active lives and active lives children, the young people we spoke to, nearly 70% of them were doing less exercise than they normally would. And even though 59% of them have been walking during lockdown, they told us that actually it was really just to get out of the house. It wasn't about being a chosen activity. It was to somehow find a way to not be in potentially a crowded space with multiple siblings with limited access to the internet. The thing that they're most missing, to answer the polling question, is their friends. So 81% of them missed socializing with their friends. To bust the myth about young people from low-income backgrounds not really being interested in proper sport, nearly 70% of them talked about missing taking part in sport. And the other dimensions that really matter to them, things like learning skills, things like having really good positive role models as coaches and leaders, all of that has been missing for nearly all of the last 14 months. So most recently, we've been doing some more consultation with young people and trying to find out what matters to them for the future. And they are talking about the pandemic within the pandemic now. The issues around mental health that they're seeing now that they're back at school and back at college make them think that mental health is probably the single biggest issue for young people going forwards. But that's also coupled with their concerns about crime and antisocial behaviour, and their desire for there to be more for young people in terms of opportunities for them in their local area. So they want improvements in parks, they want affordable access to gyms and leisure centres, they want the chance to see the wider sporting experiences that more affluent children get, and they still want the opportunity to gain training, qualifications and develop and take on leadership roles in their communities. So this is what sport can bring to these young people going forwards. It offers such a great opportunity for personal development in a place where young people are at high risk of becoming the lost generation and not finding jobs. It offers the opportunity for employability. In some communities, the pandemic has pulled people together, and you see it on the news, and that's fantastic. In other communities, it's led to suspicion, it's led to nervousness. The impact of Brexit has been very divisive on the opinions in certain communities, and the challenges around families as well, and the time spent in, as I said, quite cramped conditions, but now positively the opportunity to come out as families and play more and see the benefits that we've discussed as we've gone through. So as we look to the future, how are we going to tackle inequalities? Well, I think it needs to be about developing new capabilities within the system. And both Rachel and Warren touched on the importance of working in more of a systemic way. And in order to really tackle inequalities, perhaps over the last 20 odd years that I've been in sport, we've talked a lot about working differently. So we've run a program, or we've come up with a project or an intervention or a campaign. But what we've realized over the last 5 years is that it's far more multidimensional than that. You need to understand the difference for the young people and the communities that we're talking about, not in a patronizing way, but just the realities of life. One of the things we did in Wales recently was pay for a mum to have a buggy. Now that £50 allowed her to get her 3 children, 2 of them under the age of 4, to the local park without it being an absolute nightmare for her to try and leave the house. So you have to understand the difference in the lives of the young people and the families we're trying to support. And then we have to think differently about the way that we design things. So we have to not just accept the way we've done things over the last 20 years. And once we've thought differently, you can then plan differently, you can then invest differently. But to make all this work, we need to have a different form of leadership. And Warren talked about distributed leadership, and that is absolutely crucial. So a whole ecosystem approach will encourage all of these things to be happening. The local delivery pilots are about place-based planning. The human learning systems approach is about conversations, talking to people, not collecting surveys, going out and asking them about their experience. Not just putting money into the system, but investing in organisations that can grow in local communities, asset-based commissioning. And over time, designing things in a way that keeps up with the way that communities are shifting. We talk about ourselves as being the people beside the people. We want to be there alongside the people who change neighbourhoods. But importantly, there's a role for all of us. And we've been using this phrase throughout the last 13 months within our organisation, but I really believe it matters to the whole system and everybody that works in and around sport, because unity is strength, and there are no better sectors in terms of understanding that teamwork and collaboration can lead to wonderful things being achieved. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, everybody.